We were both maybe lacking haircuts at the point because it was right in the middle of the height of the pandemic. Everything was shut down. Now you're still looking good. I've got a little less. Maybe the pandemic was a little harder on me than it was on you.
I haven't lost any hair, but it's gotten way more gray. I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but it is way more gray than it used to be.
You're looking good. We got great filters on. You look 10 years younger.
Haven't we made it, my love? Oh, honey, look how we made it this far. Hasn't the pace been alarming, honey? But take a look at where we are. Haven't we made it, my love? Oh, honey, look how we made it.
Hello, and welcome to the Living Unleashed podcast. I'm Alex Renneman, your host. Living Unleashed is a podcast where we explore any variety of items and issues out there that might be impacting our Appalachian community, and it may be relatable to your community. And we explore not just community things, maybe things individually that are fascinating or ways that we can help optimize and find our flourishment in the world. And today we're bringing on John Deskins, who is a great guest. He's the director of WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and he has studied the West Virginia economy for many years and offers great insights. And we brought him on today to talk to us a little bit about where is the economy really here in the state, and because it's eye of the beholder, and it can, depending on political whims and who's trying to position it as what's really happening today, where do we stand, and maybe why. What are some of those indicators that we can look to say this is why we are the way we are, and that then parlays into what can we do and where are we maybe heading? And I think what really brings it home is what can we do in each of our communities to help influence that to the positive. So I'm grateful that John's joined us on the episode, and I hope what we talk about today is valuable to you and your community. I know every year you create a comprehensive economic outlook for what's going on in the state of West Virginia. I don't know whether you went down to the legislature just recently and shared with them, but I'd love to hear from you what your perspective is as an economist around what's happening in West Virginia's economy.
Right now, given the way the situation is, you really need to step back and look at the nation to understand the picture in West Virginia. And, nationally, we've had this major bout with inflation that was driven by various factors. I can explain if you want. But to combat the inflation, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates very aggressively from the early part of 2022 through the late part of last year, so a year and a half or 2 years in this cycle. The Fed raised interest rates as aggressively as they have ever done. They've never raised interest rates as quickly and as sharply as what happened over the last 2 years. They're doing this to fight inflation, and I think that what they've done has generally been the right thing to do. But when interest rates go up that much, that really puts a strong headwind in front of your economy, whether it be nationally or in the state. The last time the Fed raised interest rates almost this aggressively, the result was a severe recession. So if you look back in 2022 or most of 2023, economists were pretty worried that was going to happen again. I mean, the Fed was doing this to get rid of inflation, and we had to do that. Economic history has taught us that we cannot allow inflation to persist. It will wreck the economy if we allow it to persist. But we were worried, but we don't know exactly how aggressively we should raise rates. We want to raise rates just enough to get rid of inflation, but not to tip the economy into recession. But this isn't like a fine-tuned machine, like a fancy Swiss watch or something like that. We don't know exactly how hard to go. If the Fed doesn't go hard enough, then inflation will keep going, and that's a bad thing. If the Fed goes too hard, it'll tip us into recession. And the Fed's been pretty aggressive, so that's why a lot of people have been worried about recession fears. So, fast forward about 2 years now, and it's so far so good. Everything's looking pretty good right now. Inflation has come down from its high, which was 8 or 9%. Very, very high rates of inflation, the highest that we've seen in 40 years. Inflation has come down from that level down to about 3% now. So that's tremendous improvement in inflation. And so far, we are continuing to grow. Output's continuing to grow. Employment's tending to grow. So far, it seems like the Fed has actually struck that balance pretty well with the right amount of aggressiveness to get rid of that inflation, but not tip the economy into recession. Now, that said, we expect continued growth. We don't expect a recession, either nationally or in West Virginia. The outlook is positive, but we do expect growth to be relatively muted over the next couple years. And that's not because of anything weird. That's just kind of naturally what you would expect when rates have gone up this much. Like, for example, I don't want to go on about this forever because I know we're just getting started here, but last year, for example, if you look at home construction and home sales, it was a terrible year for that kind of activity because of those rates. But that's normal. That's what you would expect in this environment. But to answer your question now, we expect growth. We expect no recession, but we expect the growth to be slower than normal or slower than what we would hope for at the least. That may not be the answer you wanted to hear, but honestly, if you look back at economic history and if you look at other interest rate cycles like this, that's a good answer because the alternative could be a hard recession.
It is, John. I'll tell you, as a novice economist, or just someone who dabbles in it, I continually through all these things happening, I thought, oh, this is it. This is what economic theory teaches you. This is what's going to happen, and it didn't happen. And there's something else. It was absolutely a wild ride, and maybe folks such as yourself were much more aware of what was happening. But I just kind of look at this. I'm like, the basic economic knowledge I have tells me this is going to happen, and then it didn't. And you see the stock market soaring, and you see all kinds of things just playing out. It seemed almost untethered and unrelated. So it really is, I think, a huge testament to what folks were doing at the Fed and elsewhere that we haven't seen this massive recession and responses. I mean, seems like now maybe too early to call, but it seems like we've threaded the needle in many, many ways here in this economy.
That's exactly what I think. Again, we're not through it yet. I do want to caution you, by the way. I said inflation had gone from 8 or 9% down to about 3%. Well, we want it to go to 2%. That's the target that we have too. So inflation is still 1.5 times as high as we want it to be. So we still have at least 6 months, economists believe, before we get through this, before we get inflation back, and so we can move forward beyond this ordeal. But you're right; it does seem like the Fed has struck that balance just right, and it's a good thing. I think they're doing a good job. I think we've kind of got lucky so far. But I will say the economy is a lot different than it was the last time this happened in the early '80s, and there are some reasons to think it's believable that the Fed did a much better job now than they did in the past. I won't bore you with that because I could talk for the whole hour on how the Fed's engagement in the economy has changed, but it makes sense in some ways.
Yeah, and it's wild. And of course, this is all barring any other geopolitical or natural disaster, whatever could happen that could always just turn the tides. But as it is, if we kind of then dial down into West Virginia, then so like, what do we have? Obviously we've had our stalwarts through the years, our extraction industries and such. But what do you see in terms of economic sectors within the state that you think are performing well today?
Honestly, I don't have a sector by sector breakdown for you. I can tell you this. West Virginia has not performed as well over the COVID era since January 2020, since the last time we spoke, basically. West Virginia has not performed as well as the nation. We are actually almost exactly where we were in January 2020. We lost 14% of our jobs. For the first year and a half of recovery was very strong. But for the last year and a half, recovery's been continuing. We've been continuing to grow, but it's been much slower. So I haven't checked the jobs number in 1 or 2 months, but the last time I checked, West Virginia was actually a couple hundred jobs less than where we were in January of 2020. That's not much. We have 700,000 jobs altogether, but we still haven't fully recovered. The nation, on the other hand, has fully recovered and added another 3 or 4%. So we haven't done as well as the nation. We expect to continue to grow, but we expect growth to be relatively strong this year, but for the next couple of years, we expect it to be just barely in positive territory. As far as sectors go, our state economy is so different from region to region.
Great point.
We do expect, healthcare to be strong in some regions. We have some regions that are kind of bastions of healthcare in some ways. We expect manufacturing to grow at a healthy pace in a couple parts of the state. We expect energy output to grow at a healthy pace in a few parts of the state. But it varies widely across the state altogether. And some of the growth is kind of new growth off of the kind of the pre-COVID base, and some of the growth in some sectors for some regions is still just kind of the final recovery over this turbulence from the last few years.
What do you? That's really interesting. Because if you're just following headlines or whatnot, depending on what the political leanings are or what somebody's initiative is, you could say, "Hey, we're gangbusters," or "It's in the dumps," right? Whether that's on the national level or the state level. But it's interesting that we've kind of like from West Virginia perspective, we've almost recovered. What would you attribute that to? I mean, what's maybe holding us back, or challenges, obstacles that are facing our economy that you can maybe speak to?
Well, a couple things there. The first thing I want to speak to is what you said first there. You look at some places and you hear good news and you hear the things are going in the right direction and you hear all this positive encouragement. For example, if you look at announcements coming from the Department of Commerce, the Department of Economic Development, they do have a lot of good news.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing in West Virginia. We have a few regions that are doing well and that have momentum. And we have these announcements of this company coming in, or that company coming in, or this other company coming in. We have good things happening. So anytime you hear the Department of Economic Development touting a good economic development achievement, they're being truthful. They're not lying. That actually is happening. That's right. But the good things in West Virginia happen to be concentrated in about 10 or maybe 15 counties at most. The good stories kind of are the same places over and over and over again. So we have the good news. If you watch the news in certain places, it's just all good news saying we're moving in the right direction. But if you look at kind of the broad statistics, aggregate statistics coming from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, kind of the numbers that I kind of talk about, they're much more muted. But that's because the good news stories are being offset by about 40 counties that are just stagnant. And they don't get much news because nothing's happening. Not really much, not much good is happening. Not much bad's happening. Maybe slight decline. So they don't make the news. Does that make sense what I'm saying there in terms of?
Totally makes sense. And I mean, you can see those headlines as you see. It is exciting to see this plant wanting to come here or whatever, but then you see this other manufacturing facility stop and here's 300 jobs gone. And it makes total sense that it would kind of level out.
That's absolutely true. But even in other cases, it's just kind of a slow bleed. The Department of Economic Development announces 500 jobs here, but we have 10 counties that lose 20 jobs each. And it offsets to some extent like that.
It's a really good point. Are there any, and I know you're not a policymaker to that degree, but are there certain policies that maybe from an economic perspective or that would help positively impact West Virginia and maybe even those counties? I'm not saying like share the wealth because the counties that are seeing that growth are seeing that for a reason, right? Maybe that's where they're located. It could be proximity. It could be all kinds of things. But are there policies or just approaches that we could take as a state to maybe help alleviate some of this?
Well, there are. It's hard for me to answer that, though, because I could literally talk for an hour about that. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that we don't have barriers to economic development. We want to make sure that we don't have tax policies or regulatory policies or just weird policies that are really archaic or vestiges of the past that are serving to impede economic development. We want to make sure we don't have any of those policies hampering kind of a big business coming into the state, or a policy like that would hamper a new entrepreneur from creating something new in the state. I don't have any policies like that to give you right now, but if I were in charge of everything, I would do a full rundown of all of our policies to make sure there's nothing keeping
down the walls.
Activity away.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I've got two more things I want to talk about. One thing is human capital. To convince a business that it needs to come to West Virginia, the business needs to be confident that it can find the workers that it needs. Right? The business wants a lot of things. It wants a good regulatory environment. It wants good tax policy. It wants good infrastructure, of course. But it also has to be confident that it can find the workers that it needs. And one of the biggest challenges we face in West Virginia, so this is something I talk about all the time. One of the biggest challenges is we just have deficits in human capital. By human capital, I'm talking about the number of people who are ready, willing, and able to work. People who are well-trained, healthy, drug-free. Across all those dimensions, though, we face deficits. If you look at our labor force participation rate, that is the share of the adult population that is working or actively looking for work. West Virginia is last among the 50 states in terms of labor force participation. That's a big problem. If you look at other factors that kind of relate to workforce participation, if you look at educational outcomes, West Virginia's at or near the bottom, depending on which specific measure of education or training or workforce preparedness you're looking at. If you look at health outcomes, if you look at overall mortality or obesity or diabetes or cancer or whatever, West Virginia is at or near the bottom in those rankings. If you look at drug abuse, West Virginia is, if you look at the number of opioid overdose deaths per person, for example, West Virginia is at the bottom. And it's shocking, actually. That particular statistic is shocking, and we are an outlier. That is, we're actually, the line comes kind of like this, and then we're actually way worse than the 49th state. So all these problems affect West Virginia in kind of human ways. Obviously, if you don't have a good education, if you have poor health, if you're suffering from drug addiction, those affect you and your family and your friends in many, many, many ways. But just narrowly from an economic development perspective, they keep businesses away from West Virginia. Because if a business comes here, if it's thinking about locating in, I don't know, Braxton County, let's say, that's right in the middle, so I chose it. If it's thinking about coming to Braxton County, but if it starts doing some investigations and finds that it has a hard time finding the workers that it needs who are healthy and well-trained and prepared for the workforce, and if it finds that a lot of people can't pass the drug test, that's going to keep that business away. So, these problems are big problems.
John, I want to dig into it just a little bit. And I know you're not going to be the shell answer man for all these things because these are complex problems. But, growing up in West Virginia, let me start a little later than that. I remember early on reading some of your reports, and that phrase, workforce participation, just hit me like a ball bat in the back of the head, because growing up in West Virginia, we're hardworking people. We go out, we aren't afraid to hard work. We'll get out and get it done. And then I look at the statistics and I see this workforce participation rate is so stinking low. I know we're still 50th or whatever, but are we improving there at all? And maybe just everybody else is improving faster, or no?
A rank isn't improving. Right? I mean, if we're 50th, we haven't improved any. I will say the participation rate did fall during COVID, and it has risen back since then. So the actual number has improved over the last 2 years, but all states have kind of moved. All states have fallen through that COVID trajectory. So the statistic has improved, but a rank in a kind of relative position to the nation hasn't really improved. It may have improved by half a percentage point, but it's still a big problem. What I mean to say is the deficit between West Virginia and the national average has maybe improved by like half a percentage point, but we're still 8 or 9 points below the nation, and it's still a big problem. I think it's actually our most important problem.
Yeah, well, and I've heard you say that before. I knew we were going to get into that, and I don't see any easy answers. Obviously, the opioid epidemic has been a huge that we can all look and point to that really easily. What can we do? What can we do around workforce participation? Is it literally about immigration? Is it bringing people into the state? What is it?
Well, it's hard to say. Sometimes I just defer. Like, I don't know I'm not an expert in public health. I don't know what we can do to improve diabetes or cancer or whatever. I just kind of say it's an important issue. You need to be aware of this problem, but you need to consult with the experts who know about public health. Same thing with drug abuse. I'm an economist. I don't know the best ways to combat drug abuse. I just know that it needs to be on the radar front and center for policymakers. There's not an easy answer. I mean, it's a step by step. You have to, so for example, if we do improve educational outcomes, we face the brain drain problem, which, we make a step forward, brain drain happens, we make a step back. So there's not an easy solution. It's not going to happen overnight. We're still going to be talking about this 10 years from now. I'm sure of it. The problem may not be as bad, but I guarantee it's going to take us at least that long to fully fix the problem. So you just have to take positive steps every chance you can get. You have to constantly be aware of the problem and looking for positive steps here and there. You can't, you have to have the right goals. You can't expect to fix the problem overnight. If that's what you're targeting, you're going to fail. But if you are looking for momentum and movement in the right direction, then that's what you have to do. That's more appropriate.
Well, and it ultimately seems like, I think we could, as a citizenry, stand and say, all right, fix this, state legislatures and the governor and whatnot. But it feels like this one's right here at home. I mean, every community has to make some decisions around how they're going to treat, public health and education and those things, and where they're going to put the priorities. Because I'm not sure. I mean, policies can help for sure, but it does feel like this has got to be grassroots as well.
Here's another issue, and I don't think people always fully appreciate this. In West Virginia, we have some counties, like I mentioned before, 10 or 15 counties, regions, that have momentum, that are moving in the right direction. We have other counties that have fallen into this vicious cycle. Just think with me here for a second. If you look at certain counties, you go back historically, the counties suffered from a lack of industrial diversification, too much reliance on coal. Right? You want a diversified economy where multiple sectors are moving in the right direction. That way, if some shock happens to one sector, you have other sectors that are growing that can fill in the gap. It's healthy economy is characterized by industrial diversification. So we didn't have that. We had some counties where the reliance on coal was overwhelming. So there's a shock that happens, and those coal jobs leave. This shock has actually been happening for a long time. For a long time, production was still high, but we were still suffering the shock because of increased mechanization was laying people off. And of course, in more recent years, we've just been losing production. Anyway, there's a shock happens. And when the shock happens, people have to move elsewhere to find work. I myself am a migrant outside of a coal community. When I was 18 or 22, whenever, I had to move away to find work because there's no jobs in my hometown. My hometown was old coal mining community. So when the outmigration occurs, the people who are moving away tend to be younger, healthier, better educated, better prepared for the workforce. I don't know why, but that's just what the statistics show. And so when the outmigration occurs, the area now is becoming older, less healthy, less educated, less prepared for the workforce. On top of this, it's very clear that drug abuse correlates highly with lack of economic opportunity. So these areas that start falling into this downward spiral, that's the places that tend to see way more drug abuse, especially over the last 2 decades. So think about it. We didn't have enough diversification to begin with, but now we find ourselves with a dwindling population, older population, less healthy population, less workforce prepared population, and a bigger drug abuse problem. So this makes the situation worse, and it drives away even more business. So we find ourselves in this vicious cycle or in this downward spiral. And that's really the characterization that applies to a bunch of our counties, sadly. So when you think about economic development, the tools that we have are better equipped at taking an area that has momentum and accelerating that momentum. In an area that has momentum, you need to focus on traditional things like better infrastructure, better human capital development, site selection, being able to provide sites to new businesses, quality of life amenities. All these traditional economic development approaches are applicable to areas that have positive momentum. It's easier for us to take an area that's growing 1% a year, do what we need to do, and make it grow 2% a year. But that's a lot easier than taking an area that's in decline and turning that around into positive momentum. So when you think about economic development in West Virginia, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing because accelerating momentum in a place like the Eastern Panhandle or North Central is different. It's a different problem than creating new momentum in McDowell County. So there's really kind of 2 different ways to think about it for those areas that are in the vicious cycle world. One is you can look at an area like North Central West Virginia, and as it grows more and more over time, that prosperity will broaden out geographically. So you can take an area that's subject to the vicious cycle, that's adjacent to a prosperous area, and let it grow out. Otherwise, what you have to do really is you have to look for a spark. You have to look for something different, something entrepreneurial, something outside of the box that just changes the dynamic to create some positive momentum. The spark doesn't have to fix everything. It just has to create momentum. And that vicious cycle can start working in the opposite direction. And migration will come in. The area will start to become younger. Drug abuse problem will start to disappear as people have more of a vision for a future if they have opportunities in front of them. So you have to think about a spark, something different for those areas. A spark can be something like a new big plant, if we can attract one, like a big battery manufacturing plant, for example. That could be an example of a spark. A spark could be something like developing a tourist mecca. Look around at the beauty that we have in West Virginia. We have some tourism. We've done some stuff to improve tourism in recent years. But when I think of somewhere like Gatlinburg, Gatlinburg's got nothing on West Virginia in terms of what it has there to begin with, to build from. We got the New River Gorge National Park. That's just as beautiful as Smoky Mountains. There's so much more that we can do to develop tourism. So you see what I'm saying? There's not an easy answer, but you have to find something that's specific to that region that works with that region's comparative advantage and that will start to create momentum. It's not going to solve every problem overnight, but it will turn the vicious cycle around into a virtuous cycle.
John, I just let you go because what you just delivered was a masterclass in how these our communities need to look at this. When you described that decline, so my home county, Taylor County, we weren't directly had a lot of coal jobs, but we had a lot of railroad jobs, which were ancillary from the coal, right? So a supportive job in an economy. And as that railroad left when I was younger, growing up, the Grafton of old just continued to decline because we didn't really have that kind of diversification. Now, we're fortunate in that, to your point earlier, we may be one of those counties that's on the edge of where you've got all that growth in Mon County and even some of the extractive resources, the natural gas in Harrison County, those areas that might help. But the strategy here in Taylor County needs to be very different than a strategy in, you mentioned Braxton or McDowell or Jefferson or wherever it may be. It's a masterclass. It really is.
Absolutely.
I'm completely buying what you're selling.
But, no, Taylor's a perfect county. I mean, we can develop new things in Taylor County that are directly associated with Taylor, but it is also benefiting. I had actually forgotten that you live in Taylor County, by the way. I live in South Mon County, and my house is only about 2 miles from the Taylor County line. So
there you go.
I'm actually very, very close to Taylor County. And when I turn to go to my house, there's hundreds and hundreds of cars that still go every day that I don't know exactly where they're turning, but I'm pretty sure they're going into Taylor County. Same thing actually Preston County as well. But those are both counties that are, part of the north central growth, even though they weren't like the origin points necessarily.
Well, and you talk about this spark, and it's been many years ago when I started my technology company here in Grafton. Now, I underestimated the workforce availability here for a technology company, software development company. I traveled out a lot. There's not really a lot of customers in West Virginia, they're all out. But I intended, John, really, and maybe that's just a wet forest floor and it takes a while for that spark. I intended to be that spark in our county or a part of that spark to help engender some of that. And maybe it's 20 years an overnight success and 20 years in the making, but I'd like to think at some point, technology jobs in Grafton can be a thing, right? And can be a real interesting piece. And the pandemic, although brought us many challenges, also changed mindsets for folks that they can come to these small towns. So a lot of those individuals that have moved out, those types of, maybe not the same ones, maybe some of the same ones, but of the same socioeconomic or the education levels or whatever productivity in society can move to some of these small towns we have that are just absolutely just quaint, awesome places in West Virginia and be working over the internet anywhere, right? And I think that's an advantage we have.
Well, absolutely. That's actually another thing. When I was talking about potential sparks, I didn't list this as an example. I didn't want to go on for forever, but attracting remote workers to West Virginia is a potential spark. And I think it actually has been working to some extent already over the last couple of years, although I think there's even more that we can do. But absolutely. And like your example is a perfect example. We have to have somebody who's entrepreneurial, trying different things, taking risks. That's what it takes to really turn an economy around. And I think it's fantastic that you're doing that for the Taylor County economy.
Yeah, well, I don't want to oversell. I'm trying. Let's put it that way. It's not always easy, but this is my home and it's important to me. And
I mean, you're not going to solve you're not going to be the only one. I mean, Taylor County needs multiple entrepreneurs like you, but you're doing the right thing, and you're a good example of exactly what we need. So don't worry about overselling. Nobody's thinking you're going to fix the whole problem, but you're a great example of what we need.
Well, I appreciate that. And John, we're getting close on time, but this has been great. And I do want to ask you just kind of, if you had your crystal ball, seeing what data you have, but also seeing momentum, knowing kind of policies that are maybe coming from the state level or seeing things. And again, I know it's hard to ask you a question about the entire state because, to your point, we have very different regions and counties and things, but looking ahead, what can you see in your crystal ball? Like, what's the vision that you see most likely for West Virginia in the near and long term from an economic perspective?
Well, again, I think growth is going to be okay for this year. 2024, I think, is going to be just fine, but I do expect muted growth for the next couple of years. But to really answer your question, what I view, I'll just be brutally honest here. I do expect this trend to continue. But I think we are getting more counties we're changing counties from this slot to that slot. We're getting, we have the slot of counties that are subject to the vicious cycle and that are stagnant, and we have counties that have momentum. And we do see more counties going into the positive category. we're not going to get all 55 counties. My honest truth is, this is not what a politician would say, but my honest truth is we're not going to get all 55 counties in that positive category. Some of the counties are going to continue to be stagnant for the next 20 years, but we're getting more in the right growth category. And I think that's encouraging. I think that's a good thing. And I'm celebrating that. Even if we can get what's half of 55, even if we can get 30 of our counties in the positive growth category, I think that would be tremendous improvement from where we are today, and that would be a great thing. But just the data nationally with urban-rural changes and evolution, I don't think all counties are going to get there, but we are getting more areas in the right in the right category.
Yeah, I think that's encouraging to me. I mean, obviously we would always want everybody, but I think it's encouraging to me that's even, within reach, that we could really expect to change a good portion. Even if it's a quarter of our counties or half would be, I think, a huge win. And I don't think that's setting the bar low. That's a big ask, really.
Yeah, no, I'm actually taking that as an optimistic view for the future, although a reasonably optimistic future, not a Pollyanna notion where I imagine just everything's perfect. But I think that's a reasonably optimistic outlook.
Well, that's great. Well, John, if people want to know more about what you all are doing up there, or want to engage you either from a policy standpoint or just locally, how do they reach out? How do they connect?
Well, the best way is just to Google WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research. The web link's a little bit of a pain. I would just say Google WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and it should be pretty easy to find me. And we have some information on our website, or just email me directly if you need help understanding the state's economy.
Awesome. Well, John Deskins, the director of WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research, I really appreciate you coming on the program. I do not want to wait several years to have you on again. We'll bring you back. I know you're constantly reviewing and updating your report every year. We'd love to bring you back on and tell us more about how many counties are we switching over, right? Are we making that progress? But thanks again for coming on the program and all you guys are doing up there.
Yeah, happy to do it. Call me anytime.
Will do. Thanks.